Elara was a widow. That was the first and last thing the town of Providence knew about her. She lived in the small, weathered cabin her husband had built at the far edge of the valley, where the meadows gave way to the hard granite shoulders of the mountains. Her possessions were few: a sway-backed horse named Copper, a set of well-oiled tools that fit her hands as if made for them, and the journals. They were her husband's legacy, bound in cracked leather and filled with a decade of his sharp, angular script. Elias had not been a farmer, not like the others in Providence. He had been a geologist, a man who read the land not for its topsoil, but for its bones. He had mapped every seam of quartz, every iron deposit, every shift in the great stone plates that slept beneath the valley floor. But mostly, he had studied the weather. He recorded rainfall in fractions of an inch and wind speed in meticulous charts. He noted the first frost and the last thaw with the gravity of a historian marking the birth and death of kings. In the final year of his life, a new urgency had entered his writing. He wrote of a cycle, a long, slow rhythm in the earth that he had finally deciphered. A pattern that stretched back centuries, visible only to a man who looked at ice core data and tree rings the way others looked at ledgers. The cycle was nearing its peak. His last entry, dated the day before a rock slide took him on the high pass, was chillingly clear. "The patterns are convergent," he wrote. "The jet stream anomaly, the solar minimum, the cyclical deep ocean currents. It is a perfect confluence. The coming winter will not be a season. It will be an epoch. 7 months, at least." Elara read those words over and over until they were branded onto her mind. She looked out her window at the lush green valley, humming with the business of a warm August. It seemed impossible. Madness. But she had never known Elias to be wrong about the earth. She turned the page. There, sketched with an engineer's precision, was the plan. A design for a dwelling he called the Hearthstone. It was not a house to be built upon the land, but within it. It was a shelter designed to be buried, to borrow its warmth from the planet's deep geothermal heart, and to weather a siege of ice and snow. That night, Elara made her decision. She would not grieve. She would build. The next morning, she rode Copper into the center of Providence. The town was a collection of proud, timber-framed buildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. She tied the horse to the hitching post outside the town hall and went inside. Mayor Thompson sat behind a desk of polished oak, a man whose substance was measured in his girth and the gold of his watch chain. He looked at Elara over his spectacles, his expression one of polite impatience. "Mistress Elara," he began, his voice smooth and condescending. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Elara did not waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice steady, "I need permission to quarry stone from the south face of the old tor." The mayor leaned back. "Quarry stone? For what purpose? Your cabin is sound, is it not?" "I am not repairing the cabin," she explained. "I am building a new shelter, a winter dwelling." She laid one of Elias's journals on his desk, opened to the design of the Hearthstone. She explained the principles: the excavation into the granite face, the use of thermal mass, the insulated ventilation flue. And then she told him why. "The coming winter will be long," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My husband's research indicates a duration of at least 7 months of deep cold and heavy snow." Mayor Thompson stared at her. For a moment, there was silence. Then he chuckled. It was a low, rumbling sound. He closed the journal and pushed it back across the desk. 7 months, he repeated, as if savoring an exquisite joke. My dear woman, your grief has unsettled you. Providence has weathered 100 winters. We have a new steam-powered snowplow arriving by train next month. Our larders are full. We are a civilized people, not burrowing animals. His tone was final, patronizing. Permission to deface the tour is denied, he said, turning back to his paperwork. I suggest you see Dr. Finch, perhaps a tonic for your nerves. Elara took the journal and left without another word. The story was all over town by noon. The widow Elara had lost her mind. She believed a 7-month winter was coming. She wanted to dig a hole in the mountain and live in it like a badger. At the general store, the gossips traded the tale over barrels of flour and bolts of cloth, their laughter sharp as scissors. Dr. Finch, a man whose education made him believe he understood all things, held court by the apothecary counter. Utterly unhygienic, he declared to the nodding men around him. Living in a damp cave is a recipe for consumption and lung fever. The darkness would weaken the spirit. The body needs light and fresh circulating air. It is scientific fact. The richest man in the valley, Mr. Sterling, heard the news while overseeing the construction of his new mansion on the Western Ridge. It was a monument to modern architecture, with vast walls of plate glass that faced the majestic, and soon-to-be deadly, mountain peaks. A grave, Sterling laughed to his foreman, gesturing with a fat cigar. The woman wants to build her own grave. Let her. I prefer a view. The project, which Elara began anyway on her own land at the base of a smaller, private cliff, was given a name. Elara's Folly. The children would point as they passed on the road. There's the crazy widow, digging her hole. The name became a part of the town's lexicon. To pull an Elara became slang for embarking on a pointless, obsessive, and foolish endeavor. The mockery was a constant, buzzing insect at the edge of her hearing. She ignored it. Her work began on the 1st of September. The sun was still warm, the air thick with the scent of late summer clover. The cliff face she had chosen was solid granite, baked by 1 billion years of pressure. It faced due south, just as Elias's notes dictated. It would drink the low winter sun. Her tools were simple. A sledgehammer, star drills, wedges, and a pry bar. The first day she worked for 10 hours and succeeded only in chipping a hand-sized divot from the rock face. Her palms were raw, her muscles screaming. She went back to the cabin, ate a silent meal, and read Elias's notes on fracturing rock. Follow the fissures, he had written. Do not fight the stone. Persuade it. The next day, she did not swing the hammer with brute force. She tapped. She listened. She found the faint hairline cracks, the subtle lines of weakness in the stone's ancient face. She set the star drill. Tap, turn. Tap, turn. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic. For a week, she did nothing but drill holes along a single fissure line. The sound was a lonely metronome marking the slow death of summer. Tap, turn. When the holes were deep enough, she hammered in the steel wedges. She moved from wedge to wedge, striking each one with a measured blow, tightening the pressure. For hours, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a deep groan, a crack appeared. It spread, connecting the drill holes in a jagged line. With a final sharp blow, a slab of granite weighing 1/2 ton split from the cliff and crashed to the ground. Elara looked at the raw, fresh rock she had exposed. It was the first step. The work found its rhythm. Drill, wedge, split, pry. Copper, her horse, became her partner. She rigged a harness and a stone boat a heavy wooden sledge, to haul the broken rock away. The beast strained, muscles bunching under his hide, dragging the heavy loads to form a wide, terraced yard in front of the growing hollow. Day after day, the cavity deepened. An inch, then a foot, then a yard. The townspeople would sometimes stop on the road below to watch. It was a form of entertainment. "Still at it," they would say, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and contempt. "The poor, mad thing." October arrived. The aspens on the mountains turned a brilliant, fiery gold. The air grew crisp. The cavity was now the size of a small room. Elara began the finer work. She used a smaller hammer and chisels to smooth the walls and floor. It was not a cave she was carving. It was a chamber. She worked the stone until it was coarse but level, shaping alcoves for storage, a raised platform for a bed, and a deep, stone-lined hearth. The most critical part was the flue. According to Elias's diagrams, it could not be a simple chimney. A straight flue would create a massive draft, sucking all the precious warm air out. It had to be a complex, baffled system, a thermal-siphon, he had called it. She built it from carefully shaped soapstone blocks, mortared with a mixture of clay and ash. It snaked upward through a channel she had painstakingly cut, designed to draw smoke out slowly while allowing most of the heat to radiate back into the stone of the dwelling itself. A small secondary pipe would draw fresh, cold air directly into the firebox, preventing the main chamber's air from being consumed. It was the work of a master mason, and she learned it from the ink in a dead man's book. She framed the entrance with heavy timbers salvaged from an old barn, and built a door of thick, layered planks, cross-braced and designed to fit into a stone jamb with less than a quarter-inch of tolerance. While she worked, she prepared for the siege. She spent her evenings by candlelight, preserving the bounty from her small garden. Carrots and potatoes were packed in sand in a cold pit she dug in the floor. Cabbages were fermented into barrels of sauerkraut. Green beans were salted, and hundreds of apples were sliced thin and dried on racks until they were like sweet, leathery coins. She butchered her 2 pigs, curing the hams and bacon with salt and smoke. The fat was rendered into lard and stored in clay crocks sealed with wax. Every action was deliberate, efficient, and solitary. She did not speak to anyone for weeks. Her only conversations were quiet murmurs to Copper as she brushed him down at the end of each grueling day. The horse would nuzzle her shoulder, his presence a warm, silent reassurance. He was the only living thing that did not judge her. By late October, the town's mockery had faded to a dull, background hum. They had grown accustomed to the sight of her, a small, tireless figure working at the base of the cliff. She was no longer news, just a local eccentric, a fixture of the landscape like a strangely shaped tree. They were all too busy celebrating their own preparedness. The new municipal snowplow had arrived on the train, gleaming in red paint, its massive blade a symbol of their dominance over winter. Mayor Thompson gave a speech. Mr. Sterling hosted a lavish party to celebrate the completion of his glass-walled mansion. The entire town was invited to marvel at the central heating and the panoramic views. Dr. Finch wrote an article for the Providence Gazette on the importance of modern ventilation and hygiene in winter months, a clear and public rebuke of Elara's primitive methods. They were safe. They were modern. They were intelligent. They were prepared for a normal winter. Elara, meanwhile, was reading the real signs, the signs that were not written in newspapers or proclaimed from podiums. She saw it in the squirrels. They were not just gathering nuts. They were stripping entire branches bare with a frantic, desperate speed she had never witnessed. She saw it in the sky. The geese and ducks had vanished a full month earlier than usual, their formations heading south in a silent, panicked exodus. She felt it in the air. On windless afternoons, the atmosphere grew strangely still and heavy, carrying a faint, metallic scent, the smell of deep, high-altitude cold. She measured it with her husband's instruments. The barometer, kept in her cabin, had begun a slow, steady, and unnatural plunge, a trend that held for 8 consecutive days. It was falling not like a storm was coming, but like the sky itself was collapsing. On the last day of October, she stood at the edge of her property, looking down at the twinkling lights of Providence. A part of her, a small, human part, wanted to go down there, to scream a warning at them, to shake them from their proud, comfortable ignorance. She remembered the mayor's condescending smile. She heard the echo of Dr. Finch's pronouncements. She saw the pointing fingers of the children. They would not listen. They would laugh. They would call her mad one last time. Her warning would be a gift they were incapable of receiving. She turned her back on the town and walked toward the Hearthstone. The time for words was over. She spent the next few days making her final preparations. She hauled the last of her massive woodpile inside, stacking it tight against one wall. She filled every container she owned with water from the stream. She moved her preserved foods from the cabin to the shelves she had carved into the stone. She brought Copper into the deepest part of the hollow, a wide alcove she had designed for him, complete with a thick bed of straw and a feed trough. The horse seemed to understand, entering the stone chamber without protest. On the morning of November 5th, she woke to a world gone silent. The birdsong was gone. The rustle of leaves was gone. A profound, unnatural hush had fallen over the valley. She stepped outside. The air was ice. The sky was a uniform, bruised grey, low and oppressive. She took one last look at the world of grass and sun. Then she went inside, closing the heavy, layered door behind her. She slid 3 thick wooden bars into their iron brackets. The sound of them seating was solid, final. Inside, she lit a single tallow lamp. The small flame pushed back the gloom, its light soft and golden on the smoothed stone walls. She laid a fire in the hearth, using only 3 small logs. Within an hour, the baffled flue was drawing perfectly, and a deep, penetrating warmth began to seep into the granite. At precisely 2:14 p.m., the snow began. It did not drift down in gentle flakes. It came as a dense, driving curtain of white, hurled from the sky by a wind that moaned like a dying beast. It was not a storm. It was a physical blow. In Providence, they toasted the first snow by their fireplaces. "Let it come," they said. "We're ready for it." By the next morning, 3 feet had fallen. The new snowplow rumbled out of its shed, a proud red engine of progress. It cleared the main street, piling up huge banks of snow. Mayor Thompson watched from his window, smiling. The snow did not stop. By the 3rd day, the plow's engine seized, frozen solid. It sat abandoned in the middle of town, a useless monument to civic pride, quickly becoming just another white mound. The wind rose to a constant, shrieking gale. It forced the snow into every crack and crevice, burying houses to their eaves. The weight was immense, relentless. The power lines, the town's connection to the modern world, became coated in a layer of ice as thick as a man's arm. On the 5th day, with a sound like a rifle shot, the main transformer pole snapped, and the town was plunged into darkness and electric silence. Panic began to set in. The train had not arrived. The pass was buried under 30 feet of snow. They were cut off. The proud, timber-framed houses became iceboxes. Fires roared in hearths day and night, consuming wood at a terrifying rate. Still, the cold seeped through the walls. The first roof collapsed on November 15th. The general store. The immense weight of the snow, far beyond anything the builders had ever conceived, had snapped the main beam. Then another. And another. The sounds of splintering wood became a new, terrifying part of the storm's chorus. Mr. Sterling's palace of glass became his tomb. The central heating failed when the power went out. The vast panes of plate glass, not designed for a 50-degree temperature differential, began to contract. They held for a day, groaning and creaking. Then, in the middle of the night, they exploded inward, showering the opulent rooms with razor-sharp shards of ice and glass. The wind and snow blasted through the gaping holes, and the house was rendered uninhabitable in minutes. Sterling and his family barely escaped to a neighbour's shuddering home, their wealth utterly useless. Inside the Hearthstone, Elara was comfortable. Her dwelling was now buried under a 20-foot blanket of snow. This immense layer was not a burden. It was insulation. Perfect insulation. The outside temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The wind howled with mythic violence. Inside, the air was still and warm. The granite walls, having absorbed the heat from her small, efficient fire, maintained a constant, steady temperature of 62 degrees. The storm was a distant, muffled hum, the sound of a faraway sea. She burned only a handful of logs each day. Her life fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm. She tended the fire, cared for copper, ate her preserved meals, and read her husband's books by the steady light of her lamp. The air was fresh. The clever flue system drew perfectly, siphoning out the smoke and pulling in clean air from a tall, snow-proof vent pipe that Elias had insisted she extend 40 feet up the cliff face. She had light. She had warmth. She had food. She had water from the meltwater cistern. She was safe. She was vindicated. She was alone. December passed. Then January. The snow never stopped for more than a few hours at a time. It just piled deeper. A white death, burying a world. In Providence, it was a nightmare. Firewood ran out. People began burning their furniture. Then the paneling from their walls. Food was rationed, then ran out. Starvation became a real and present threat. Dr. Finch's scientific methods were useless. His medicines froze solid in their bottles. People were dying of cold and hunger in their well-ventilated homes. The very air he had championed was now a killer, a thief of warmth. By February, the community was broken. Hope was a frozen corpse. It was a young boy, huddled with his family and slowly freezing, who saw it first. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke, rising from a strange pipe high up on the cliff face. It was the only sign of life in the entire dead valley. It took his father, a man named Gable, 2 days to struggle through the colossal drifts. He was half dead, his face a mask of frostbite, when he stumbled into the small, terraced yard Elara had cleared. He saw the top of a heavy wooden door, barely visible above the snowline. He beat on it with his frozen fists, his voice a ragged croak. "Please, help us! Please!" Inside, Elara heard the faint, desperate sound. She lifted the heavy bars and pulled the door inward. The man fell into the room, collapsing onto the stone floor, weeping with a mixture of relief and disbelief at the impossible warmth. Elara looked at him. There was no triumph in her eyes. No, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn acceptance. She helped him to the fire and gave him a mug of hot broth. She did not say a word. The man was Dr. Finch. He drank the broth, the warmth spreading through his body like a resurrection. He looked around the chamber, at the stacked firewood, the shelves of food, the calm horse in its clean stall, the smooth stone walls glowing in the lamplight. It was not a damp, unhygienic cave. It was a sanctuary. It was the most intelligent, well-designed structure he had ever been in. "You were right," he whispered, his voice cracking. He could not meet her gaze. "My God, you were right." Elara simply nodded and ladled him another cup of broth. Finch was the first. He was not the last. Using the last of his strength, he guided a small party of survivors back to the Hearthstone, a procession of the humbled. They arrived in twos and threes, ghosts stumbling out of the white hell, families with children whose eyes were old with hunger and fear. Elara took them all in. The chamber was large, designed by Elias with extra space for contingencies. It was crowded, but it was warm. It was life. The outcast became their leader. She did not command, she simply did what was necessary, and they followed her example. She organized the rationing of the food. She established sleeping shifts. She used her knowledge of herbs, learned from her mother, to treat the frostbite and the sickness. Her calm, steady presence was the anchor in their storm of fear. They who had mocked her for being a solitary animal now huddled around her, dependent on her foresight for their very existence. The last to arrive were the most broken. One afternoon in late March, a lookout saw two figures staggering toward the shelter. It was Mayor Thompson and Mr. Sterling. The mayor's fine clothes were in rags. The wealthy rancher, who had once boasted of his view, was now snowblind, his eyes bandaged with a dirty strip of cloth, leaning on the mayor for support. Their pride had been scoured from them by the relentless wind, leaving only brittle, terrified men. They collapsed at the entrance to the Hearthstone, too ashamed to even ask for entry. Elara brought them inside. She gave them food and warmth, just as she had for everyone else. There was no accusation in her manner, no hint of vengeance. Her grace was more damning than any condemnation. The winter held its grip through April and into May. The 7th month passed. Then the 8th began. Finally, in the 3rd week of May, a change came. The wind died. The sky turned a brilliant, painful blue. A new sound was heard, the drip, drip, drip of melting water. The great thaw had begun. When the survivors finally emerged from the Hearthstone, blinking in the bright sun, the world was a ruin. Providence was a graveyard of collapsed roofs and broken buildings, half submerged in a sea of melting, rotten snow. But they were alive. 37 of them. Alive because of the woman they had called a fool. A week later, what was left of the town gathered in the muddy, debris-strewn main street. Mayor Thompson, his face thin and aged by 20 years, stood on the steps of the wrecked town hall. Beside him stood Dr. Finch and Mr. Sterling. Elara stood apart, watching from a distance. "We were wrong," the mayor began, his voice hoarse but carrying in the still air. "We were proud and arrogant, and we were fools." He looked directly at Elara. "We had a prophet among us, and we mocked her. We were given a warning, and we scorned it. We put our faith in engines and glass and our own cleverness, and it all failed us." He took a deep breath. Elara was right, he said, the words a public confession. Her folly was wisdom. Her madness was foresight. She saved us. She saved this town from vanishing completely. There are no words to properly apologize. But we must say them. We are sorry. Dr. Finch stepped forward. My science was a book of pride. Her knowledge was written in the earth. I was wrong. Mr. Sterling, his sight slowly returning, spoke last, his voice thick with emotion. I built a house of vanity. She built a home of sense. I am shamed by my pride, and I am saved by her grace. The town was silent, the admission of failure hanging in the air. Elara stepped forward then. She did not speak of forgiveness. She spoke of the future.
Pride is a poor building material, she said, her voice clear and calm. Nature does not demand our pride. It demands our respect. It does not reward cleverness. It rewards observation. She looked at the faces of the survivors, at the wreckage around them. The lesson is a hard one, she continued, but it is not a final one. We will rebuild, but we will rebuild with wisdom. I will teach you.
And she did. The town of Providence was reborn from the mud and snow. But it was a different town. They did not rebuild with proud timber frames and wide, vulnerable windows. They built as Elara had shown them. They built into the hillsides, using the earth itself as their shield and their warmth. Every new home was an echo of the Hearthstone. The phrase, Elara's folly, was never spoken again. But the expression, pulling an Elara, was reborn. It came to mean an act of profound wisdom, of seeing a truth that others were too blind to accept. It meant preparing when others celebrated. It meant listening to the earth instead of to the crowd. Elara lived for 30 more years. She never moved back into her old cabin. The Hearthstone was her home, and it became the heart of the new town, a place of learning. She never remarried. She remained a solitary figure, not an outcast anymore, but a revered sage. She was a part of the community, yet apart from it. A permanent, quiet reminder of their greatest failure and their greatest lesson. The children who had once pointed in mockery now came to her to learn the names of the plants, to understand the signs of the weather, and to hear the stories of the great winter. She died peacefully in her sleep one spring night, at the age of 84, the warm stone of her home holding her as it had for decades. The people of Providence buried her on the hill above the Hearthstone. They placed a simple bronze plaque above the heavy wooden door of the dwelling that had saved them all. It was not a monument to her, but to the wisdom she embodied. The inscription was simple, and it was read by every generation that followed. She saw the truth in the earth, while we saw only the folly in our pride. May we never be so blind again.